in this series, we've been discussing decisions that a firm makes, and we've talked about the fact that firms only really get to make a couple of decisions or answer a couple of questions for themselves. One, how much will I produce? And two, how will I produce it? Right? So we've gone through a discussion of marginal product, which sort of goes to that second part of the question, how will I produce it? And then we've talked about different costs that the firm has to consider when they're deciding how much to produce. And specifically, we've spent some time in previous videos talking about short-run costs. And now we want to look a little bit at how those things change, what other decisions the firm has to make or is able to make in the long run. So we've defined short run as the period of production in which at least one input is fixed, typically capital. You can't change the size of your building, the amount of land you have, your big machines. You can't change that in the short run, in a flash, right? It takes a little more time to change that. But the long run is the period of production in which all your inputs are variable. You can change whatever you need to change if you're given enough time. So let's talk about long run costs. What decisions can a firm make in the long run that they couldn't necessarily make in the short run? Primarily, in the long run, a firm can decide its scale. So the size of its production process. Do you want one assembly line or two? Do you want one location or two? How big should your kitchen be? How many grills should you have? The scale of your production process. What capacity do you want to be able to produce in your production process? And the goal then in deciding what scale, how big is your process going to be, is to find efficiency. You want to find efficient scale, which is the level of output in which average total cost is minimized. Average total cost being, what is your total cost per item that you're producing? Right? You want to minimize that. You want to make it as cheap as possible to produce a burger, right? So your average total cost should be minimized, and at that point, we have efficient scale. Now, when a business is trying to get there to the efficient scale, the efficient point, there are three things that could happen. One is the business could experience economies of scale. Economies of scale is good. It's when the average total cost falls as production expands. So this is with something like the invention of the assembly line, right? So prior to Henry Ford coming up with this assembly line method of producing cars, folks sort of just stood around in a circle and each person tinkered at it as they built a car, right? And it took a while. With the invention of this assembly line, now two things happen. One, we're able to produce a lot more cars, so our production expands, and we're able to produce them at a lower cost per car. So our average total cost falls. This is economies of scale. We increase our production, and by increasing our production, we're actually decreasing our cost per product that's produced. That's a good thing in business. Diseconomies of scale is not as good. So diseconomies of scale is what happens when you increase production and also increase your average total cost of production. So when might this happen? This could happen when, say, so an example given in the Mateer and Coppock textbook is of a hospital, for example. If you increase the number of beds that you have at a hospital, you may also have to increase the amount of management you have, the amount of oversight, and you may end up with some coordination problems as you increase the size of your firm, the scale of your firm, which could increase your average total costs. Now, if you experience diseconomies of scale in the short run, or well, all of these are sort of long-run questions, as scale is a long-run question, but if you experience diseconomies of scale for just a shorter period of time, that not necessarily awful, but if you continue to experience diseconomies of scale, it can be a really bad thing. The third type of scale is constant returns to scale. And this is when average total cost doesn't change at all when production expands. And an example here is if you take a fast food restaurant and you perfectly replicate it down the road, right? So your costs double and your output also doubles, right? So your average cost then hasn't changed at all. This would be constant returns to scale. If we look at what these things look like on a graph, if we sort of graphed the options for long run costs, you've got three options. You've got this line here that demonstrates economies of scale, where your average cost is falling as output increases. And then you've got this one, which demonstrates diseconomies of scale, where average costs may fall to some point, and then average costs increase as you continue to increase your output. And this one is constant returns to scale, where your average costs stay the same as you increase your output. And you'll notice that on this graph, we've got all these little gray U-shaped curves. That's just to remind us that the long run is made up of a bunch of little short runs, right? So you've got, at each point in the long run curve, you also have short run average costs going on, which we've looked at in a previous video. We know they're U-shaped. So short run average total cost is U-shaped for the reason of specialization and diminishing marginal product. Long run average total cost could be U-shaped when we experience diseconomies of scale. So we could see a U-shape in both the short run and long run, but that U-shape will be there for a different reason.